Hello, everyone. Welcome to our FCA virtual conversation. This is the 8th in our series of virtual conversations. Today, we have a very important topic and a terrific panelists who are true experts in the field of working with teenagers and the important issue of parenting teenagers, adolescents in what is a very complex world. So in just a minute, I'm going to introduce each of them, and they will tell you a little bit about their work in working with parents and adolescents. And then we'll get into some questions. And then obviously, as always, welcome questions for those of you who are tuning in, and we will do the best job we can in answering as many of those questions as possible during the time we have. So a little bit about FCA. As many of you know, we are among the largest human service agencies here in Fairfield County, very broadly based services that work with children, families, and adults and seniors. We are a licensed mental health and substance misuse organization and do a tremendous amount of work with families, children, and of course, today's topic, adolescents. We have an after-school program called the Aspire program. We do important work in the foster care space through our therapeutic services in that area. And then we have programs like our intensive in-home child and adolescent psychiatric program, also known as ICAPS, that works with children with serious mental health and behavioral issues. And then a very similar program that has been added in the last year, which is our multi-systemic therapy program that again works with a very high acuity level of adolescents and children. So that's a little bit about FCA. As I said, questions, please submit them through the channel that we've created, and we'll do the best we can to answer those. So without further ado, let me introduce today's panelists. First, Jeannie House, who is the director of our functional family therapy program in our foster care space. Jeannie has been with the agency for over 11 years. She is a licensed clinical social worker and has been an integral part of the work that we do with adolescents in our foster care area. Also with us today is Dr. Gail Melanson. Welcome, Gail. Gail is a PhD psychologist who is the executive director of the Mid-Fairfield County Health and Community Care Center. You'll hear a little bit more from Gail about her agency and what they do in a minute. And then finally, we have Margaret Watt, who has a master's in public health and a master's in counseling, and is the director of prevention services at Positive Directions, which is a hugely important agency here in Fairfield County, providing a tremendous amount of information around prevention, education, to parents and the community at large. So let me ask each of you to simply introduce yourself briefly. A little bit about your background and the work you do that relates to today's topic. So Margaret, let me start with you.
Thanks, Rob, and hi, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be here today. So my background, as Rob alluded to, I'm a background in education and in public health. Been working in behavioral health in the region for a while now. And at Positive Directions, where I'm the director of prevention, our role is working with local communities. Whether people know it or not, your community has something called a local prevention council. And the local prevention council's role is to try to prevent risky behaviors, usually in youth, sometimes across the lifespan. And that means like substance use and suicide, and promote mental wellness. And so we provide leadership to our communities, convening folks, gathering the data that supports the action, and then really planning, working together. Like everybody here in this call is a part of the local prevention coalition in Norwalk because our agencies are in Norwalk or on the border. And so, we develop plans and initiatives and policies to make lives better for our families and our youth.
Terrific. Thank you, Margaret. And Gail, a little bit about what you do.
Sure. Thank you, Rob. And hello, everyone. Thank you for having me today. So I've been with Mid-Fairfield. Our new name is Mid-Fairfield Community Care Center. We were previously Mid-Fairfield Child Guidance Center, and we changed our name to more accurately reflect the work we're doing. We're not just a child guidance center where people are coming in for therapy. We're in the community. So that's kind of why we changed our name. But I've been at Mid-Fairfield for many years, 26 years, I think it is now. And I've been the executive director for the last 5 years. And Mid-Fairfield has been around since 1957, providing outpatient mental health services. And we provide services across the lifespan. The services as it relates to the topic today, adolescents, we have an intensive outpatient program that serves 12 to 17-year-olds. And we also have an extended day treatment program that serves the younger, that overlaps a little bit. That's the 5 to 12-year-olds. And that's our more intensive programs. But we are also providing support in the schools. We're in all of the Norwalk elementary schools. We provide care coordination for families that need help accessing concrete needs and knowing about the resources in the community. And then we have our largest program, which is our outpatient program that serves all ages. And we have psychiatric provision for medication and APRNs who provide medication. So.
Terrific. Thank you, Gil.
Mm-hmm.
And Jeannie.
Thank you, Rob. Happy to be here today to talk about parenting. My own experience, I have my own personal experience as a parent, and then working in the field. Really, all of my work has been with the adolescent population, ranging from doing my own in-home work to an outpatient level of care, and now more recently in my experience with foster care. Most of our youth in a therapeutic foster care level are coming in as adolescents, which is a challenging time as it is, and then you're in foster care. So we're working with foster parents, and now in our new model of treatment, working with biological parents as well. So a lot of different experiences with parenting is not really a one size fits all for what a parent looks like. So I've been honored to have that experience to see it from a few different angles.
Terrific. Okay, so thank you all, by the way, and thank you all for joining today's discussion. So I'm going to start with a somewhat broad question, and then we're going to get into as many questions as we can. The first question is, what's different about adolescence in today's environment as opposed to a number of years ago? Obviously, a lot of things have changed. And broadly speaking, what's changed as it relates to adolescence? Margaret, I'm going to start with you.
Well, and I'm probably, Rob, you and I may be a little older than Jeannie and Gail. Let's put it this way. So we might have a few generations here involved, but I think what we've all seen, and, Jeannie said, as a mom, right? Like I've got two teens who are now just moved on to college. The current generation is growing up in a world of smartphones. That's a huge one. That has had a massive impact on how they spend their time, how they interact with each other, the information, whether good or bad, that they can access. That is a huge change. Obviously, the current generation grew up in a world of COVID with lockdown. So however old today's teens may be, or whether you have college kids or, middle school, they had a couple of years where they really lost the opportunity to develop the social skills to do the work of adolescence, which is try new things and feel really uncomfortable and learn to tolerate the distress and go, when you practice a skill, you get better at it. And so they're a little bit behind. And they also had to deal with all of us being at home with them and not, having our own distress. So those are some differences that are huge, right? That we didn't grow up with. Then there's the other thing when it comes to kids today, I think that we sometimes underestimate is how many of them are living with a lot of climate anxiety and other sort of sense. There's too much negativity out there in the world. I think we feel it as parents, but I think a lot of them have a sense of kind of gloom and doom that we have to try to help them process and maybe make sure it doesn't hit them too young. So those are some major changes that I see.
Great. Jeannie, how about you? Anything you'd add to what Margaret said?
Yeah, it's a good point you said at the end, Margaret. I like the way you phrased it, that the change in that climate, because what I think about immediately is just the level of safety and the way that we look at things
Mhm.
now is so different from my own experience growing up, right? My mom didn't have to talk to me about online safety or, so many different things, but I would come home and I'd go out and I'd play and I'd come home when it got dark and I didn't
Yeah.
have a phone to check in with anyone. And I just I was responsible and,
Mhm.
my mom knew who my friends were and it was very different. And now I think there's this like heightened anxiety around like who are my kids around and what are their influences and how
Mhm.
do I make sure they're safe when I'm not with them, that I don't think, my mom experienced as I was growing up. So it's a big shift because I don't have her to then say, well, what did you do when this happened? I have to
Right.
figure that out.
Gail, any additional thoughts?
I think the only thing I would add to the safety piece is also the obvious of the school shootings and the violence in schools that was not an issue when we were all in school. And I
Mhm.
think to piggyback on what Margaret said about this, the cell phones and the social media, kids today are always on. There's never, we all would come home and have some time to unwind. They don't have that because they're
Mhm.
constantly being bombarded by the social media, by their phones, and it's constant. So they don't really get to unplug and not worry about what the other kids in school are doing.
Terrific.
I
Thank
think
you
the
all.
other piece I just want to add on, but the other piece is we're all on all the time too, right?
Yeah.
And we're all facing some of those same anxieties, and it's hard to not bring it home with us. And so, there's like a chicken and an egg thing that happens. And I think one of the implications that we all know and the research bears out is we as parents are trying to shield our kids from so much of this stuff. And and there's like an intensive parenting model, right? Like sometimes it's called helicopter parenting or snowplow parenting or intensive parenting. And there are absolutely some good things coming from that, but it's maybe too much for us and them in some cases. And but it's a reaction to us, like if you're a parent and Columbine happens and then everything else happens, you're all about protecting your kids. We get that.
So, you've all noted in your responses some aspect of what's happened with technology and how that has changed. I think, Jeannie, you mentioned it being very different when you were growing up. Can you talk a little bit about technology and its impact on adolescence, and how can parents be a positive influence as it relates to their children related to the whole issue of technology? Margaret, I see you shaking your head first, so I'm going to go to you first.
I mean, I wish we all knew the magic bullet to that answer, Rob, but I think the first thing we can do is role model, right? So how many hours a day are we spending on our phones and on our laptops and on our computers? And one thing I realized, like in my own home life is, I started when I was on the phone in front of my kids or whatever, when I was doing things like that, I would try to label what I was doing and go, oh, I'm going to answer this call quickly because it's going to help me be ready for tomorrow, and try to make it clear, like, I'm not just scrolling mindlessly right now, and then put the phone away and meal times, no phones. And, but it's hard because we are all like trained like Pavlov's dogs to hear that beep on our phone. And we're like, what just happened? So I think role modeling is huge. I think the longer we can keep smartphones out of our kids' hands, the better, because there's a lot of research that says, there's so many impacts, right? Like kids who are on social media who already have depression, anxiety, it appears to make their depression, anxiety worse. Okay. But that, which is cause and which is effect. There are some pluses of kids who are like video gaming together or on social media together. Like for boys, especially, it seems like it's a good way of connecting with each other. But let's also set guidelines and talk about how much of your day is spent on this, because it's an opportunity cost. Like when you're on your phone or gaming or whatever you're doing with screens, you are not playing basketball and going for a walk and just talking to a friend or playing chess or whatever the thing is you're into.
Yeah, absolutely. Gail, what do you think?
So I would agree with everything Margaret said. And my advice, having 3 teenage daughters myself, some that are moving off to college, is when you introduce a phone, introduce the guidelines right away, because it's so hard to go back. once you've given them free rein and thought, oh, gee, I should really be monitoring that. I should really not let them have it, all night and all of these things. It's way harder to go back. And I would say set those boundaries when you're introducing a phone, set the boundaries from the very beginning.
Maybe
Makes a
like
lot of
maybe a
sense.
boundary is also you can't have it in your room at night, or
Right.
maybe
At
maybe you don't
night,
even have your
yes.
computer in your room. Like just
Yes.
Well,
Yeah.
and that speaks to so much of what they need it for, right? Like, aren't you getting ready to kind of like end your day, or it's the end of the night, we're going to get
Mhm.
ready for bed? Like, that's that sense of always being on, right? I have to know what's happening with my friends. I have to know what are we going to do tomorrow? What's the plan for the next day, right? It's this peer pressure that just exists kind of 24/7, right? You're
Right.
comparing what are people posting, and I have to reply to this, and there's so many apps that I mean, I feel like I know stuff, but I don't know even all of it,
Right.
because I have, adolescents I work with teaching me things. I use a lot of my adolescents to tell me about stuff, right? I don't know
Mhm.
everything when it comes to the technology that they're using. So I think asking them too, you got to educate yourself, and then you have to figure out how to help educate them, because you want them to
Right.
use it in a safe way, but you want to also know what they're using it for, what's their motivation, what are they gaining from it? How can we substitute maybe some of that technology and reliance on social media with going out with friends, like how
Mhm.
we used to socialize and engage with our peers, because there's no off button.
Right. And I would agree
I-
that it really should be a dialogue, because if it's just you setting these boundaries that they don't understand why, it's
Yeah.
going to build resentment and then sneaking
Mhm.
around and trying to get around the rules, as opposed to having a dialogue and them understanding the importance and why these rules exist, and even
Mhm.
compromising. So maybe they want to have their phone all night and you come to an agreement that maybe 10 o'clock's reasonable or whatever it is. But I think really opening that line of communication so they feel like you get it and you hear them.
And I want to add that dialogue that you want to have with the kids, it's important, I think, to think about it both in terms of the content and the emotions attached. And if you can say to the kids, like, so what are you seeing and what are you noticing? And that could be about any media, right? Like, I feel like every movie I've seen the last bunch of years that shows teens, even middle schoolers having a party, shows that they all have alcohol and drugs. And then you talk to teens, like we have teens in clubs in the high schools that we work with, and we do this Teen Nights Out series in Norwalk. And most of the teens were like, that's not the reality. But talk to your kids and go, is that normal? And what do you think? And how does it make you feel? And also, so if you are, your kid's on like Snapchat, how do you feel about what you're getting? Do you feel stressed after you've been like on your social media on Instagram? Do you feel like competitive or jealous? Like help them process that and think about it. And I also think, especially when you're talking about like the tweens, we all would love to think that our tweens are nice and innocent and don't know anything about drugs or sex or any negative thing out there. But they see everything on the internet much earlier than any of us ever used to, and much earlier than we would like them to. So that's kind of where I'm like, keep them away from it if you can, but you got to give them an opportunity to ask questions. What did you see? Did you understand it? What do you think about it? I'm here to talk. The lines were open.
So, you're all kind of helping us segue into another critical question, which you're essentially beginning to answer. For those parents who are tuning in, how do you foster that kind of open communication that, can be a real challenge when you have an adolescent? And how do you foster that? I mean, what are some of the things that you might recommend to parents that they really begin to do? And by the way, I'm struck on a couple of things. One, getting started with some of this as early as possible. And I was also struck in your comments around technology about appropriate modeling, which I think is huge. So about effective communication, Gail, let me start with you. Any kind of broad suggestions that you would have?
I would say the most important thing is to meet them where they are. A lot of times as parents, we want to communicate, but we have our own agenda. We want to find out X, Y, and Z. And that might not be what they want to talk to you about. So I think just being open and having that line of communication and being very aware of your reactions. So they may tell you things that you might be shocked by, or it might upset you or anger you, but really trying to not react to what they're telling you, because the minute you react in a way that they see as somewhat negative, or that, they've done the wrong thing by sharing that information, it's going to shut them down. So I think really trying to process that information, hear it, and then say, okay, that sounds a little scary that this happened. Let's talk about it. And how did you feel? And what can we do to make sure this doesn't happen again? Or whatever advice you're trying to give. But the advice, I think, is second, because I think the most important thing as a parent is if your kids are coming to you, that's very valuable. If your reaction shuts that down, then you're missing a big piece, and it's going to be a loss. So if your kids are coming to you and telling you things, that's great. And then just figure out how then you navigate what you're going to say after they've shared that information.
That's great. Margaret, what do you think?
I agree with all of that. I think it's so hard. I mean, I have failed at this so many times, and it's like, okay, shut up and ask the question, and like ask them the questions and let them talk, instead of like kind of, going like, but why did, even if you can remember to say like, why, like, it's like, don't always educate, just ask them and listen. Right. But I also think, Rob, you said like starting early, if you have that relationship with your kid before they become a tween or a teen, it's easier to continue it. But sometimes you don't. And then parents, I think, can start to feel like I missed my shot. And it's definitely harder to repair a kind of broken communication than it is to just maintain a healthy one, but it's never too late. Right. But then, and that's when, maybe there's some family counseling needed. But I think, one thing that we've used with some of the kids in our clubs is like just these teen talk cards, right? So you can like have a bunch of conversation cards on the table, and it's like every night, like somebody pick a card, and like that's the topic we're going to talk about, and everyone's answering it genuinely. So it's not like, did you do your homework? It's some interesting topic, and everyone gets to share like, where would you go if you had $1 million, or whatever it is, and puts everyone on equal footing. And the kids who aren't going to answer your questions when they think you're delving into their social life, once they just start talking about this other topic, now you're talking. So that also, I'm like picturing in my mind as I say that, like family dinner. And there's all this evidence that most of us are like eating on the go, or eating standing, or eating in the car. But any meals that you can have together with your family with like the phones away, any meals during the week, take pride in that and make it an opportunity.
Thank you. And I think that may be among the shifts in generations, because I think there was a generational period where having dinner together maybe was more common than it often is now. Jeannie, what do you think? What do you think about effective communication and how to encourage that?
I definitely agree, Gail and Margaret, with what both of you have said, and starting early is the best option, but we don't always have that opportunity, right? Like I mentioned, I'm in foster care. They don't have that early foundation with kids coming into their home. So we work a lot with parents on how do you have that open, honest communication with a 14-year-old that's coming in your door for the first time. There's no relationship, there's no trust. So really being open, being honest, being curious, and being consistent, following up and having that genuine concern. I love that teen talk question, Margaret, right? You want to have open-ended questions, just creating dialogue, creating opportunities to have conversation. Then teens feel like they matter, and that what you care about how they think and how they feel about things, and that you're putting effort towards getting to know what they like, right? So on that foster parent side, it's not a lost cause, that you don't write off that you won't have a trusting relationship just because you haven't raised this child, right? Some of our kids have long-lasting relationships with their foster parents into their adulthood, into many years to come, right? Because they feel like they mattered and they felt like their voice was heard. And I think the other thing that's really important when it comes to communicating with your kids, you don't have to know everything. You don't have to have an answer to every single question that they have. You don't have to, be the expert in all areas. And I think that kids appreciate when you're humble about things too, right? Or if you mess up, or if you say something that you maybe didn't want to say, you come back and you apologize and you demonstrate, right? Role modeling, like you mentioned, Gail, you're role modeling and you're showing them that we can have missteps in our communication and we can work to repair that.
Terrific. Wonderful. Wonderful responses. we had a question come in from someone who is listening in, and it had to do with how to talk to your child or adolescent. I'm going to guess you might suggest doing it before adolescence. How do you talk about sex? So Gail, you're shaking your head first. I'm going to go to you.
So as parents, that's one of the tough ones to talk about. And I think exactly like you said, Rob, hopefully you've talked about body parts and, kind of had open dialogue to think so kids don't think it's a taboo subject to talk about your bodies or your feelings, sexuality, all of those things. Not all of us have had these open conversations since kids were little. So I think the most important thing is to keep in mind it's not a talk. When we were young, it's like, oh, did your mom have that talk with you?
Yeah.
It shouldn't be a talk. It should be a conversation, an ongoing conversation, because as they grow, they learn new things. So if your 13-year-old is asking you a question versus your 7-year-old, you want to make it appropriate to their age and find out what they know. What are they really asking about? So, we don't want to believe that our 13, 14-year-olds probably know way more than we ever did when we were 13 or 14. So really talking about what they know, what their friends are doing, and what their question is. And, and being honest and transparent. Not that you have to share every little thing about your life, but, you may talk about, I wish I hadn't done this at this age, or I wish I had waited, or I regretted this certain thing that I did because it wasn't the right person, or I did something that I was pressured into rather than just doing what I wanted to do. So, you can use yourself, and I think kids really appreciate that. And we aren't perfect, and I think it's okay to portray to them that we aren't perfect and that we've learned, and that it's okay for them to make mistakes and learn from it.
Great. Jeannie, what do you think?
I definitely would echo what Gail's saying, right? Being honest, and being direct, right? Don't avoid it, because if you avoid it, they're gonna try and find it out on their own, right? Either on the internet or from their friends that also found it out from the internet. So they're gonna find their own means of getting that information, and knowing what's age appropriate. Being open from the beginning. Like I have little ones, right? I haven't had a lot of that talk yet. I have a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old, but we have talked about our bodies and how we keep our bodies safe, and who's allowed to see our bodies. So it's age appropriate. And then teens I work with in care, when they don't want to talk about it, the first thing I say to them is, if you can't talk about it, then you shouldn't be doing some of the things that you're doing. So we've got to be able to talk about it. How do you keep yourself safe and healthy? It can feel uncomfortable, but it is a part of our development. It's part of human nature. So let's talk about things. And if you have that foundation, again, you have a little bit of a connection and alliance, you can talk about difficult things.
Yeah, terrific. And Margaret, what are your thoughts?
Everything that everyone said is so correct. I want to just kind of add, I was thinking, conversations about sexuality are like other conversations, like conversations we should be having with our tweens and teens, and even from childhood on, like around substance use, right? The risky behaviors are things that you can't do once and done, that are also involved with information they need, misinformation they may be getting from their friends or on the internet that we have to like identify and correct, and family values. So I think part of it is also making sure, if there's like 2 parents or guardians or whatever in the family, like, are you on the same page? Like having that pre-conversation with each other, making sure they're not hearing one message from one parent and one from another, or only ever hearing from the mom and never hearing from the dad. Not to say that that would ever happen. But and then when it comes to sexuality, one thing we know from data, because I conduct youth surveys in local communities, kids are actually, and national data says the same thing, kids are having sex later. They're getting involved in sex much later. I think that goes back to what I alluded to earlier, that kids are kind of developmentally a little at a earlier stage in their development now than maybe a generation ago. But Our data says by middle school, there's a lot of sexting going on. It's like they feel pressure to send each other pictures. Like we literally ask questions like, do you feel pressured to sext? Meaning sending pictures that are sexually involved. Have you received sext? Like that's a whole thing that our 12 and 13-year-olds are dealing with. And so we have to be talking to them about that and helping them process that. I'm so glad I'm not a 12-year-old today.
So let's shift just a little bit to an issue that I think seems to be much more about today's world than it certainly was when my daughters were younger, or certainly when I was younger, and that is the whole issue of sexual identity. And obviously, the world has dramatically changed. People are identifying as bisexual, non-binary, gay. So that's an issue that obviously is coming to us, and it's an issue that is part of adolescence as well. So I guess the question to the panel, and maybe I'll start with you, Gail, and we'll go around. How do you talk about that with your adolescent if that is something they are wanting to talk about, and how do you respond and be supportive as a parent?
So I think the same theme applies, just to be open and honest, have an open line of communication. I think acknowledging that adolescence is a very confusing time. So what an adolescent, because an adolescent girl might feel attracted to another adolescent girl at age 13, does that mean that that's going to define her throughout her adulthood? It doesn't necessarily. It might, but it might not. So giving teens permission to not know exactly what their sexual identity might be, and that's normal, and to normalize that adolescents are going to experiment and may not necessarily have made up their mind in one direction. But I think also being accepting of whatever their decisions are, and trying to understand where their decisions are coming from and what's helping them make their decisions, because sometimes they may get a piece of information and think, oh, this must mean I'm a lesbian, or oh, this must mean that I'm something, and it may not. So I think just really trying to get at where they're feeling confused, if they are, and trying to be as accepting as you can. And I think one of the big factors that plays in is when you have generations and you have, multiple family members. So one parent might be very accepting of an adolescent's feelings and thoughts, and another parent might not. And that's where kind of what Margaret was saying, to really work to be on the same page. Mm-hmm. If it's a 2-parent household, if you have grandparents living in the house, really to have conversations with the adults and how the adults are responding, because kids are having a tough enough time themselves, never mind having adults give them mixed messages and blaming and shaming and those type of things.
And kids are going to know when you're genuine too, right? So don't say something because you think you should say it. Say what you really mean, and think about the messaging that you're giving to your youth, because they know when it's like the real you, right? Just as well as you know them, they know you too. So be genuine in your response. And if you are unsure of how to support them, again, it goes back to that humbling, then you can say, this is new for me and I'm not sure, and I'd like to learn with you, or I'd like to do this in collaboration, right? And then show an alliance for your child. I think that would be a very meaningful and impactful message as well.
Margaret, what about that piece that both Gail and Jeannie are talking about, that also relates to parents' feelings about their adolescents, maybe still trying to determine, and maybe even anxiety that an adolescent child might be saying, look, I think I'm non-binary, or I think I'm gay, and any advice you could give to parents who themselves might be struggling with that declaration, if you will.
I think that's a real genuine question, because as much as, Gail, you were alluding to, like some teens might be confused. They're not sure of what their gender or sexual identity is. And then a lot are absolutely sure. And we have little kids who know what their gender identity is or their sexual identity, and that, a generation or two prior would never have dared to express it. But because it's more acceptable to talk about it now and we're more aware of a range of identities, sometimes there's the disconnect is between the kids and the parents, but that's a dangerous place, right? If you don't feel like you can be who you are at home, then that's not good for your mental health. And I've had friends who've gone through this. I've had friends who've said, you know, the person I raised as a daughter is now non-binary and wants me to use different pronouns, and that's so hard for me, or they want to use a different name, or and there are, you know, I love how Jeannie said, like, you know, try to grow into it together and go, you know, you're my child and I love you and I support you and I want to learn and I'm going to make mistakes and that's okay. And then there are resources like in Fairfield County, the Triangle Community Center is our Pride Center with programs and support groups and educational programs. PFLAG is a national organization that's existed forever. It's Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays, but it encompasses the gender and sexual spectrum. And I do think, you know, I know that the issue of identity has been very politicized and some people have very strong feelings about it, but I think we can all agree that we don't want our kids to be suicidal over not feeling that they're loved and supported. And that is the reality. In any survey that you see, the population that identifies as, you know, in the LGBTQ community has higher rates of depression and suicidal ideation. Not because the identity itself is the mental illness, but because of feeling discriminated against or unempowered to be who they are, not supported at home. And the data also says that when kids who are LGBTQ, some identity, when they feel support at home, when they feel support in their community, when they feel accepted at school, those problems, you know, are cut in half, the mental health and the suicidal ideation. So we have to be respectful of everyone.
Yeah, you know, that point about parents learning as much as they can and ultimately being accepting, particularly as it relates to an adolescent and how they feel safe at home. Hugely important message, it seems to me, because as we all know, and you said it, Margaret, beautifully, this has become a politicized issue. And there are lots of external places where, you know, an adolescent who may be looking at their sexual identity in a way that doesn't fit other people's model. There's got to be a safe place. And hopefully that becomes the
If home's not it, yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
And I would encourage parents that some of that work they may not want to do with their teen. They may want to do to work with their teen to support them, but they may need to go on their own journey to come to terms with what their teen or their son or daughter or whatever may decide. And so that might be a separate journey. So they can support their teen as they need to.
Another pivot here a little bit. And again, I think certainly from my sense, things have shifted in this generation relative to the pressures around succeeding academically. And in the case of young people, getting into the right college, it does seem like the bar in terms of pressure has gone up significantly. So Gail, I'll start with you. What's your advice to parents, given the fact that there's this unbelievable sense of competition and expectation around academic achievement?
I think the most important thing is to help teens to realize that whatever their goal is not the be all end all. So if they wanted to be, you know, on a certain travel team and they didn't make it, that's okay. Life will still go on. So it's important to have goals, but I think teens or kids in general get so invested in achieving that goal. And if they don't achieve it, that's where we're seeing kids devastated and feeling like their life is over. And I think as parents, we have to teach them this was one milestone you were hoping to get to, and it doesn't mean that you failed. It means that, you know, you move on and you kind of pivot and you figure out what else. You might have had your top school, but you should have 5 others. Maybe you don't go to college, and that's not the worst thing. So kind of just being really accepting of whatever it is that they choose to do, but helping them to manage. So I think we have to look at what are our expectations as parents for our kids, and what pressures are we putting on them, and what are our own kids' expectations, and what pressures are they putting on themselves and their friends, and the neighbors, and all of those things, and really trying to keep it in line and keep it in perspective that if you got a C on a test, the world is going to keep moving, and it's not the end of the world.
Yeah. Margaret, what do you think?
Yeah, it's like you said, Rob, things have gotten just harder and harder, right? I think the stuff that we used to, like taking AP exams, which are quote unquote college level classes in high school, that used to be reserved for like a few top kids in the school when they were a senior. And now we have like middle schoolers taking AP classes. You have elementary school kids talking about building their resume to go to the right school. That's, I'm going to say, kind of crazy. And so I always think, like, what makes us feel mentally well? What makes us happy in our lives? And I feel like it comes down to like three things. There's people, there's passion, and there's purpose. So you need to feel like you got your people around you and supported. And there's kind of an epidemic of loneliness right now in a lot of ages. So let's make sure our kids feel like they have real friends, not just teammates who they like practice with but don't like hang out with. Right. So let's give them people, because then they'll be successful wherever they are if they have good, solid relationships. Like passion, let's help them not build a resume to build a resume and to have achievements. Let's have accomplishments where we feel internally satisfied that we learned a skill that we were interested in, or we did something we felt good about, right? And then like having a purpose. So like your purpose shouldn't be like, I am going to get into the hardest college I can get into because that's my goal in life. Like my purpose is like, I want to make the world a better place, or I want to, travel the world. Like, what is it? What are your goals that you're intrinsically motivated by? And I think if we can help kids look at life as I'm defining who I want to be in the life I want to lead and not being determined by outside stuff, that's really huge. And then everything Gail said around like managing expectations. And I think we can also share where we pivoted in our lives, or something we failed in our lives, or we had to, and show like every failure is actually, it's a detour, right? You thought you were going this way and instead you went that way. What did you learn from this and from that? And whatever you do in your life, you bring those experiences and skills forward, and it makes you a more experienced, better person, and you can do something new after that. And we have to teach that, because that's all about resilience and not just stressing about everything.
So it sounds like the advice includes being open about your own experience and how it was not necessarily a straight line. And Jeannie, I'm looking at you, and your children are very young,
Yeah.
but in your work, it's a population that may not be looking to go to top Ivy League schools, but the issues of, progressing and moving on relative to whatever level of college, trade school, there's clearly an element, I'm sure, of pressure that the adolescents in foster care feel. So what's your take?
It's so difficult. Most of my adolescents in care are just hoping to graduate high school. Right. They don't necessarily have that big, long plan yet. They're kind of a little more day to day, a little more moment to moment. Just want to get through high school. And then I think they have this pressure because they don't want to be like that foster kid that made it, right?
Mm-hmm.
They just want to be the kid that made it, right? So like that label sometimes puts this other like level of pressure on them that they just don't want to feel. So, they want to prove to themselves they could do it, not because they're in care, but because they could do it. And they hear a lot though, like, oh, wow, you're in foster care and you did that. Like, well, I could have done it no matter what, like wanting to have that success and that accomplishment without like the label of being a child that's been in care. Which I think is it's already like a really tough thing that they feel, ostracized for by peers, or hide it from a lot of their peers too. It amazes me how many teens I work with that they are like, oh, don't say that you're my worker, or don't say, my friends don't know, so as much as there's so much transparency, right? Going a little back here to this technology and social media, the transparency, but it's the transparency that it's what you're putting out there. It might not necessarily be the reality, but this is your truth that you're putting out there, and your perception of how you want the world to see you. And sometimes that's a little different than what life is really like that you're experiencing.
Mhm. So thank you. So another shift and a hugely important issue for parents and adolescents is substance use disorders. I actually just got back from an addiction conference and was getting updated on the epidemic as it relates to opioid use and some of these things that are quite frightening. And of course, the changes in the brain for young people who start smoking marijuana at a very young age. So all things that you are aware of. So to the parents, um, you know, concerns that they may have about their adolescent and their substance use, how to tackle that? What's any guidance you can give to a parent who's really, really worried and maybe really concerned? Gail, I'll start with you.
I just assumed you were going to start with Margaret. This is her wheelhouse.
We're going to get to her. Believe me, we're going to get
No
to
worries.
I think, again, open honesty, ask questions, be curious. If you suspect your adolescent is smoking marijuana or, using substances, to really be curious about it. It's not the time. You want to give your adolescent privacy, but you also want to be aware, and you don't want to have blinders on and realize after the fact when it's, kind of too late to intervene. I think, with the legalization of pot, and I'm sure Margaret will talk about this, that it's, some people are feeling like, well, it's legal, so it's okay.
Yeah.
But I think the biggest problem is the impact on the developing brain, which is why we don't want young kids smoking marijuana on a regular basis. It's, the science and the chemistry shows that it does impact their brains and impact their learning. And just be aware. I mean, are you noticing changes in their behavior? Are you noticing changes in friend groups? Those are usually, if you have that gut feeling and you're worried, usually you're on, trust your instincts with that. And be involved. If you see your adolescent hanging out with individuals that you don't think are positive influences on them, depending on the age, you have a say in that. So, insert yourself in that way, but in a way that feels like, you're having some dialogue and conversation, so they understand your decisions and understand why you're doing some of the things that you're doing.
And Jeannie, how about you in the work you do?
Yeah, I think it's all coming back to this foundation of communication, right? And when you feel like you have the ability to say difficult things, it's because you've had that trusting, kind of open and honest dialogue already with your youth. And the more restrictive you might want to approach something, the more they're going to want to do that, right? So not that you don't have rules, but you have a dialogue around the rules. I like how you said that, Gail. Like it's a conversation. It's not a lecture, because that's going to be perceived very differently.
Yeah,
And
I would
Margaret?
add, yeah, I think there are a few positives for for parents to know about substance use today. Number one, the use of substances in youth has been decreasing for literally decades. Because look, like when I was in high school, everybody was able to smoke at like 16, and then the drinking age was 18, right? Like as we've changed laws, which has happened, the legal age for substance use has changed over the years because of the data showing like, oh, it's messing with their brain. We are damaging their brains because their brains are developing until they're in their mid-20s. So as the laws have changed and the awareness has changed and campaigns have changed, substance use has dropped dramatically. Actually, of course, marijuana is the one that's like maybe increasing now because of the new laws. But I'm saying this because part of what we can do as parents is make sure we normalize that most kids are not using substances. That is 100% the data in our local towns here in Connecticut and Fairfield County, state data, national data. Most kids aren't using substances. So when we try to send these kind of harm reduction messages that are like, well, when you get to high school and you're at these parties and everyone's using weed, let's practice a refusal skill. You want them to have refusal skills, but it's like, hey, if you happen to find yourself with the one group of kids who's using weed, maybe go hang out with someone else, right? So part of it is there's good news. They're not all doing it. So watch how you talk to them about it so you're not normalizing it, right? The other piece is, believe it or not, teenagers actually do derive a lot of their values from what their parents say. So when parents send clear messages, you know, like as they're growing up, they're like, I don't want you to use substances until you are of legal age because it will mess with your brain and it's bad for your mental health. Like if you're, and when people are talking about vaping, you can use an opportunity to see someone vaping, you're like, oh, I wonder how that's going to affect his sports performance, right? Like, but if you send regular messages, I don't want you to do this, they do actually listen. We have data to prove it. And you would be surprised how often we think we've sent clear messages. And then we ask the kids and they're like, yeah, my parents don't really ever talk to me about alcohol or drugs. They don't have clear messages. The other thing is, think about the access they have in your home. Most of us have liquor in the home. Can they get it when we're not there? Is it locked up? Do you have liquor stickers, which we make available in a lot of our local communities? Can they get into the medicine cabinet and find prescription drugs and start experimenting? You want to lock that stuff up and you want to safely dispose of the stuff that is not in use anymore. So you really want to share, you know, your values around that stuff. And I think the final, oh, and there's an app I wanted to recommend. The federal government has an app that's free called Talk, They Hear You. And it's to enable parents to get updated information about drugs and have conversation starters to talk to their kids. And then to even go like, I told my kid this and they came back at me with X and I didn't know how to respond. So that's a useful resource. But then the other piece is, because Rob, you were also talking about what if the kid is already using or is at risk. And I think a huge piece that you're going to want to get to the bottom of is, why did this kid start using substances when the majority aren't? So is it boredom? Okay. Is it loneliness? Is it curiosity and experimentation? Is it peer pressure? Is it self-peer pressure? Is it, you know, these are reasons why kids start using substances. So mental health is probably one of the biggest ones. They're self-medicating for depression or anxiety. You can't address the substance use unless you address the depression and anxiety. But if it's just boredom or curiosity, don't forget that the teen brain is seeking out novel experiences. That's why so many kids are risk takers more than adults. But there are healthy novel experiences like go to the adventure park or like challenge yourself to learn some new thing or do something that's, you know, like a safe risk. And then there's unhealthy risks like, you know, oh, let's try this psychedelic and maybe mix it with some alcohol. Like, you know,
Yeah.
so give them healthy opportunities.
Yeah. You know, it occurs to me because you all noted the importance of open communication, non-judgmental communication as being a real theme. But one of the things that you all touched on in one way or another was the importance of role modeling. And it occurs to me that in this particular question, that if there is heavy alcohol or drug use going on in the home, I think maybe sometimes parents need to be reminded that that is going to have an impact on your child and
Yes.
adolescent,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
So, you know, because they're watching, as you all have said. And
Yeah.
if you're saying one thing and you as a parent are doing something dramatically different,
Mm-hmm.
they're going to follow the piece that you're doing dramatically different.
Right.
So
I would just, I think don't underestimate the impact that the role modeling has on adolescents. I think we know that when kids are little, they mimic us, but I think people forget how important the role parents are as role models for adolescents. So I think it's really important to keep that in mind. That they're watching you with relationships, with substances, with your social media, with your telephones, all of it.
And a great example there of role modeling and how you're behaving with substances, like when your kid starts driving, you know, you can download driving agreements from like various websites that are like, you know, what are the rules around my kid being a driver, et cetera. But boy, how powerful is it if you go out as a family to a restaurant and you have 2 drinks and then you go, I'm not going to drive home. We're going to call an Uber because I had 2 drinks. And actually restaurant sized drinks are probably more the equivalent of 3 or 4 and I'm definitely impaired. You admitting that is huge, right? Parents don't want to admit that. And if you even empower your kid, if you sign this like agreement that's like, I never want you to drive or impaired or get in a car with someone else who's been using anything, and that includes me. And if your kid can come to you as a teen and go, hey, mom, hey, dad, I noticed you had a couple of glasses of wine or a margarita or two at that thing. Like, why don't we take an Uber home? And they
Yeah.
can say that to you and you agree, that's a powerful relationship right there.
Yeah. So we have just a few minutes, and this has been great. All three of you have been just terrific and very specific, and I really appreciate that, and I'm sure the audience does as well. Let me ask a question. I'll ask each of you, which is one that I think parents would always want to do, which is to encourage their adolescent to develop healthy relationships. How can a parent, or can a parent, encourage that in their adolescent in terms of developing healthy relationships? So I'm going to throw that out. Who wants to jump in first?
So I can
will.
start with that.
Go ahead.
Sorry. You know, I think it's this theme that we've really had this afternoon about that communication and being open and honest with them. But then there's this level of independence that adolescents really want to exert, that they choose their friends, right? I get to choose my kids' friends still a lot, right? Because they're little. So, you know, I have so much influence over their peer group still, but there's going to be a natural development and point where I don't have that same level of influence. But I hope that I've encouraged and, you know, taught really healthy ways that we interact with our friends and with family members, and what we look for and what we value in our relationships with others, that then they can carry that with them and have some trust that your teens did learn all these things, right? That you were a good role model, that they did garner all of this from their young years with you, that they can take that into their adolescence and they know what's best for them.
And Gail?
So I think one of the most important things is teaching kids how to navigate healthy relationships. Healthy relationships don't just occur. You have to nurture relationships. You have to communicate with people. And I think role modeling that. So when you're upset, do you scream and yell, or do you try to have a conversation? Do you cut people off? Oh, they got you angry. That's it. I want nothing to do with them ever again. Or is it the opposite, where people keep not treating you well, and you know, and your adolescent or yourself or people in your family keep going back to those same relationships? So it's, how do you navigate it? How do you teach people how to treat you? So if people are continuing to mistreat you and you continue to go back to that relationship, what does that say? So really communicating with kids about that, and how you deal with, you know, when you aren't agreeing, when there's conflict, how do you handle those conflicts? Because those conflicts will happen, and teaching them healthy ways to manage those conflicts.
Yeah.
And
The only
Mark?
thing I'll add is just the access piece, right? Like, where do kids get to hang out with other kids? There's so much of our lives, or their lives, is really structured. It's like, you know, I go to school from this time to this time, and then I go to this practice, and then there's this sport, and then there's this other extracurricular, and then there's all my homework. And like, the only times you see other kids should be like, all the times you see other kids shouldn't be where like someone is leading a group to do a skill. You need to hang out, right? I think I mentioned before, like in Norwalk, we have these monthly teen nights out, and it's like, just come and hang out and go skating or bowling or whatever. I think that's another shift in this generation. There's less time for that stuff. Like, build it in, find a way to build it in.
Yeah,
Because then you
great.
get to practice those relationships.
That's great. Well, that's a great way to end on that question. And we are actually to the end of our time. I want to thank Margaret and Gail and Jeannie. I think you've provided a wealth of information. We've gotten emails coming in, by the way, on how helpful many in the audience have felt with what you have shared today. So many, many thanks.
Wonderful.
There will be a follow-up to those who have tuned in through an email of resources that are available. So if you signed up for this virtual conversation, you will get a list of resources as a takeaway. And please, for those who've tuned in today, stay tuned. We will be doing another virtual conversation not too far in the future. And again, I cannot thank the three of you enough. A great virtual conversation. So thank you all. And thank you all for tuning in.
Thank you.
Take
Rob,
care
thanks so much for the
Thank you.
opportunity.
Thanks,
now.
Rob.
Great, great. Take care now.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.